This chained prisoner wrote words that outlived empires and changed humanity forever. He was not writing books, he was fighting for lives he loved. A man sat in Rome, locked in chains beside a silent soldier. No crowd, no stage, no applause, just ink, breath, and urgency. And yet what he wrote would echo across centuries, reaching you today. This was Apostle Paul, and this was not ordinary writing. He was not creating theology, he was rescuing people from confusion and collapse. People who were drifting, doubting, breaking under pressure, and losing their direction. And somehow, those fragile letters became the most powerful messages ever preserved. But here is the truth most people never realize when reading them today. You have been reading them out of order and missing the real story. The letters were arranged by length, not by the life behind them. Like sorting someone's final words by size instead of by meaning. And when you change the order, something unexpected begins to happen. You stop reading documents, and you start watching a life unfold. A life shaped by conflict, pressure, sacrifice, and relentless forward motion. A life that keeps moving, even when everything tries to shut it down. And if you look closer, it begins to feel strangely familiar to you. Because this is not just his story, it mirrors something inside your own life. Moments where you felt lost, questioned, or pushed beyond your limits completely. Moments where what you believed was challenged by voices louder than truth. Moments where fear crept in quietly and slowly began to take control. And that is exactly where this story truly begins to take shape. Not in peace, not in comfort, but in tension that refuses to stay silent. Because the first letter we have was not written in calm reflection. It was written in frustration, urgency, and something dangerously close to anger. And that anger did not come from pride. It came from something deeper. It came from watching truth get twisted and people get pulled away. And once you see that moment clearly, everything else starts to connect. They nearly killed him for this message, and he still refused silence. He had just walked away from cities where stones almost ended him, places like Galatia where crowds turned violent and left him for dead. And somehow, he stood back up and kept moving forward without hesitation. Because what he carried mattered more than the pain trying to stop him. He had planted something fragile, new believers holding on to uncertain hope, people who had just begun to believe their lives could finally change. But then something happened that cut deeper than any physical attack. Other voices arrived, sounding confident, persuasive, and dangerously convincing. They told those believers something that sounded right, but changed everything. They said faith alone was not enough and never truly would be. They added rules, rituals, expectations, layers that slowly suffocated freedom completely. And maybe you have heard that voice before somewhere in your life. The one that tells you you are still not enough as you are. The one that says you must prove yourself before you are accepted. And that is exactly why this moment became so explosive for him. Because this was not a small disagreement, it was a complete distortion. So he writes, not gently, not carefully, but with raw urgency inside. I am astonished you are turning away so quickly from truth. No greeting, no warmth, no slow introduction, just immediate confrontation. Because sometimes truth does not whisper, it interrupts everything you thought you knew. And then he says something that still shakes people even today. Even if an angel brings a different message, do not accept it. Because truth does not change depending on who delivers it confidently. And here is the center of everything he was fighting to protect. You are not made right by what you do or achieve. You are made right by what has already been done for you. Not earned, not negotiated, not built through endless, exhausting performance cycles. And that idea, simple but powerful, changes how you see yourself completely. Because if that is true, your worth was never meant to be proven. It was already given before you even realized you needed it. And once that truth starts to settle, something else begins to surface. Because when people lose clarity about truth, fear slowly begins to grow. People were dying, and they believed those souls were lost forever. That fear spread fast, quiet, heavy, and impossible to ignore completely. Because when death enters suddenly, it does not ask for permission. It breaks routines, interrupts hope, and leaves questions without easy answers. This was Thessalonica, a city where belief had barely just taken root. New believers, fragile faith, no structure, no guidance, no long history. And then loss arrived, and everything they believed started to shake. They had heard about hope, but now they were facing reality. Friends, family, people they loved were suddenly gone without warning. And the question that haunted them was deeper than simple grief. What happens to those who die before everything is fulfilled completely? Do they miss it? Do they lose everything? Are they forgotten? And if you are honest, you have probably asked something similar. Because death does not just take people, it challenges what you believe. It forces you to face what comes next, or if anything does. And in that tension, fear begins to rewrite your understanding slowly. That is when he writes back, not with theory, but clarity. Not with abstract ideas, but words meant to stabilize breaking hearts. He tells them something that flips their fear completely upside down. The ones who have died are not left behind in silence. They are not forgotten. They are not erased. They are not missing. They are first, not last. Ahead, not behind. Part of something greater. And suddenly grief does not disappear, but it begins to shift. Because loss feels different when it is not the final chapter. And hope begins to return, not loud, but steady and grounding. Because maybe what looks like an ending is just a transition point. Maybe what you thought was absence is actually presence in another form. And that idea changes how you carry pain moving forward every day. But something else happened that revealed a different kind of problem. Because some people took that hope and misunderstood it completely. They stopped working, stopped contributing, waiting for everything to end quickly. And once again, he had to bring balance back into reality. Hope was never meant to remove responsibility from your daily life. It was meant to give you purpose, even when things feel uncertain. Because belief is not escape, it is direction inside real life. And when that direction is clear, something stronger begins to form. But not every place struggled with fear. Some collapsed under division instead. This church was destroying itself, and they did not even realize it. Not from outside pressure, but from inside ego, pride, and division. This was Corinth, one of the richest and most chaotic cities alive, a place where everything was available and almost nothing had limits. Money flowed freely, culture mixed constantly, and morality blurred quickly everywhere. And right in the middle of that environment, a community was formed. A group of people trying to live differently inside a collapsing system. But instead of standing strong, they began turning against each other slowly. They divided into groups, following personalities instead of truth itself. Some claimed loyalty to one leader, others chose another voice entirely. And suddenly unity disappeared, replaced by comparison and subtle competition everywhere. But it did not stop there. Things went further than anyone expected. They were taking each other to court over conflicts that should stay private. Trust was gone, replaced by pride that refused to back down. And even worse, behavior crossed lines that shocked the surrounding culture. Things happening inside were worse than what existed outside their walls. And instead of correcting it, they were strangely proud of tolerance. They called it freedom, but it was actually confusion disguised as progress. And maybe you have seen something like this in your own life, where people defend what is wrong because it feels easier than truth, where standards disappear and everything becomes acceptable without clear boundaries. And that is where he steps in, directly, firmly, without hesitation. He addresses every issue, every conflict, every distortion of what matters. But right when tension reaches its highest point, something unexpected happens. He pauses and shifts the entire conversation in one powerful direction. Because the real problem was not behavior. It was something deeper. It was the absence of something that holds everything together consistently. So he writes words that would outlast every argument they created. If you have everything but do not have love, you have nothing. Not less, not incomplete, but absolutely nothing of lasting value. Because without love, every action becomes noise without real meaning. Every word becomes empty. Every effort becomes hollow and disconnected. And suddenly the focus changes from what you do to why. Because you can be correct and still completely miss the point. You can win arguments and still lose what actually matters most. And that realization cuts deeper than any correction he could give, because it forces you to look at your own internal condition honestly. Not your image, not your success, but your true intentions underneath everything. And once that question is asked, there is no easy escape anymore. Because truth always leads you inward before it changes anything outward. And as if that was not enough, he goes even deeper still. He builds a case for something people were starting to question seriously. The idea that everything rests on one event that defines reality itself. If that event is not real, then everything else collapses completely. But if it is real, then everything changes, permanently and irreversibly. And that tension forces every listener to make a personal decision, not about others, but about what they truly believe themselves deeply. And just when things seem to settle, another shift begins forming quietly. Because this time, the pressure does not come from them anymore. It comes directly at him. Personal, targeted, and deeply painful inside. They attacked him personally, and this time it cut deeper than anything. Not stones, not prisons, but betrayal from people he truly trusted. Because it is one thing to suffer outside, another to break inside. And this moment was different, quieter, but far more painful to carry. He had returned, hoping to restore what was already fragile before, but instead, he was humiliated, questioned, and publicly disrespected by others. Voices rose against him, claiming he was weak and unimpressive in person. They called themselves superior, more qualified, more powerful, more convincing leaders. And suddenly, everything he built was being slowly pulled apart again. And maybe you have faced something like this before in your life, when your intentions are questioned and your character is misunderstood completely. When you try to do right, but people rewrite your story anyway. And the natural reaction is to defend yourself, prove your worth quickly. But what he does next is completely unexpected and deeply revealing. He does not list achievements, victories, or moments of visible success. He lists pain, suffering, and everything that nearly broke him apart. Beatings, shipwrecks, hunger, sleepless nights, danger from every direction, constantly. His resume becomes a record of survival, not a display of power. Because his authority was not built on image, but on endurance. And that changes how you define strength in your own life. Because strength is not always visible. Sometimes it is what remains unseen. Sometimes strength is simply refusing to stop when everything says quit. And then he reveals something even more personal, something rarely shared, a weakness that would not leave, something that stayed with him constantly, a struggle he asked God to remove, again and again, repeatedly. 3 times he pleaded, hoping for relief that never actually came. And the answer he received was not what he expected at all. "My grace is enough," was the response that changed everything. Not removal, not escape, but strength to endure what remained present. And that is where the story shifts into something deeply personal. Because maybe you are carrying something that has not gone away. Something you have asked to be removed, but it is still there. And the question becomes, what if it is not meant to leave? What if it is shaping something stronger inside you than comfort could? Because sometimes growth does not come from relief, but from resistance. Sometimes purpose is built inside the pressure you cannot escape easily. And that realization does not remove the pain, but it reframes it. It gives meaning to something that once felt completely pointless before. And once meaning enters the struggle, everything begins to change. Slowly. Because now you are not just surviving, you are becoming something different. And from that place of weakness, something stronger begins to rise. But this was not the end of his message or understanding yet. Because now he prepares to explain everything in its fullest form. This letter rewired human identity forever, and most people still miss it. Not emotional first, not reactive, but structured, precise, and impossible to ignore. This time he writes to people he has never actually met before. No shared memories, no personal influence, no existing trust to rely on. Which means everything must stand on truth alone, nothing else supporting it. And he begins with something uncomfortable, something people avoid facing honestly. Every person falls short, no exceptions, no categories, no hidden advantage anywhere. Not the moral, not the disciplined, not even the deeply religious ones. Because the standard is not comparison, it is perfection no one reaches. And that realization hits harder than most people are ready for, because it removes every excuse we use to justify our condition. And maybe you feel that tension even as you hear this now. The quiet awareness that something is not fully right inside you. The gap between who you are and who you think you should be. And instead of softening it, he leans deeper into that reality. Because truth does not heal by hiding, it heals by exposing completely. But this is not where the story ends. This is only diagnosis. Because right after that, everything begins to shift dramatically forward. You are made right, not by effort, but by something already done. Freely given, not earned, not negotiated, not built through performance over time. And that idea sounds simple, but it changes everything underneath it. Because if that is true, your identity is no longer unstable. It is not built on success, failure, or the opinions around you. It is anchored in something that does not move when life shifts. And from that foundation, something new begins to take shape inside. Peace replaces pressure, not instantly, but steadily and deeply over time. Because now, you are not fighting to be accepted anymore daily. You are learning how to live from something already given to you. And that changes how you face everything else in your life. Because if acceptance is secure, fear begins to lose its control. And once fear weakens, your choices start to look different too. But he does not stop there. He goes even further inward. Because knowing truth does not remove the struggle you still feel. There is still conflict, still tension, still moments where you fall short. He describes it clearly, the battle between intention and actual behavior. Wanting to do good, but somehow repeating the same patterns again. And if you have ever felt that frustration, you understand completely. Because awareness does not automatically produce change in your actions. And that honesty makes this message feel real, not idealistic or distant. But then comes one of the most powerful shifts in the entire letter. There is no condemnation for those who are now in Christ. Not reduced, not delayed, but completely removed without condition or hesitation. And that changes how you see yourself at the deepest level. Because shame loses its authority when it no longer defines you. And once that weight lifts, something else becomes possible in your life. Freedom not to do whatever you want, but to become who you are. And he builds this to a conclusion that still echoes today. Nothing can separate you from the love that holds everything together. Not failure, not time, not forces you cannot even fully understand. And that statement is not poetic. It is absolute and unbreakable truth. Because if something cannot be separated, it cannot be lost either. And that realization creates a kind of security most people never experience. But even with that clarity, questions still remain about the bigger picture, about history, about promises, about how everything fits together completely. And instead of avoiding it, he addresses it directly and carefully. Because truth is not afraid of complexity when it remains consistent. And once everything is laid out, one final shift takes place. Because understanding truth is only the beginning of living it daily. And now the focus turns from belief into action shaped by it. Because what you know begins to transform how you actually live. And that is where everything becomes real, not just understood intellectually. But even with clarity, life does not suddenly become easy afterward, because soon everything around him would begin to close in again. Everything stopped around him, but his purpose refused to stop moving. Chains locked his body, but they could not silence what he carried. This was Rome, but not the Rome he once imagined reaching freely. He arrived not as a preacher, but as a prisoner under constant guard. Day after day, a soldier stood beside him, watching every movement closely. No travel, no crowds, no public influence like before in open cities. And from the outside, it looked like everything had finally ended. Because when movement stops, most people assume the story is over. But what happened next completely changes how you see limitation forever. He did not go silent. He became more focused than ever before. From that small room, chained, restricted, he continued writing letters outward, letters that would shape identity, purpose, and belief for generations ahead. And maybe this is where the story becomes personal for you, because you have moments where life feels paused, stuck, and restricted too. Moments where progress stops and everything feels smaller than it should. And the question becomes, what do you do when movement disappears? Do you stop completely, or do you adapt and move differently forward? Because he chose something most people do not consider at all. He used limitation as a place to refine what truly mattered inside. He wrote about purpose, not as theory, but lived reality in chains. He wrote about identity, not built on freedom, but rooted deeper than circumstance. And then he writes something that feels almost impossible to understand fully. Rejoice always, he says, and he repeats it again with emphasis. And remember, this is coming from someone facing possible execution soon. So this is not surface positivity. This is something much deeper. A kind of joy that is not controlled by what happens around you. A stability that exists even when everything external becomes uncertain suddenly. And that forces you to rethink what joy actually means in life. Because maybe joy is not the result of comfort or easy conditions. Maybe it is the result of connection to something that does not change. And from that place, he begins to describe something even greater. The idea that your life has meaning beyond what you currently see. That you are part of something designed, not random or accidental existence. That your actions, relationships, and choices fit into something much larger. And suddenly, your life feels less isolated, more connected to purpose. But he does not stay in abstract ideas. He brings it closer. He talks about daily living, relationships, choices that shape real life. How you treat people, how you respond under pressure, how you lead. Because belief without action eventually collapses under its own weight. And then he uses something right in front of him as example. The soldier beside him becomes a picture of something deeper spiritually. Armor, protection, readiness, awareness, all connected to how you live daily. And what was once just a guard becomes a living illustration of truth. Because when perspective shifts, even limitation becomes a source of insight. And that is what makes this moment so powerful in this story. Because nothing changed externally, but everything shifted internally within him. And from that internal shift, something continued to move forward outward. His body was confined, but his influence expanded beyond anything before. And that challenges how you define what it means to be free. Because maybe freedom is not the absence of restriction around you. Maybe it is the presence of purpose that cannot be contained inside. And once you see that, limitation stops feeling like an ending. It starts looking like a different kind of beginning you did not expect. But even this season would not last forever as things escalated again. Because the next chapter would be quieter, colder, and far more final. This is how it ends. Alone, cold, abandoned, yet completely unbroken inside. No crowds, no letters of praise, no movement, no visible influence anymore. Just a dark cell beneath Rome, stone walls holding silence and finality. And this time, everything feels different, heavier, closer to the end. Because this is not house arrest, not a rented room with visitors. This is a dungeon, underground, where light barely reaches the floor, where men are lowered down, not invited in, and often never leave. And now he is here, after everything he has already endured before. Beatings, shipwrecks, betrayal, pressure, years of relentless forward movement. And still, the story does not end in comfort or recognition. It ends here, in a place most people would never choose willingly. And maybe that is the part that feels hardest to accept. Because we expect meaningful lives to end in visible success somehow. We expect closure to feel rewarding, complete, justified after all effort. But this ending looks nothing like that expectation we often carry. Because most of his companions are gone, scattered, or have walked away. Some sent out on missions, others choosing easier paths far away. One even abandoned him, loving comfort more than the cost required. And that kind of loneliness cuts differently than physical suffering ever could. Because pain from people leaves a deeper mark than pain from circumstances. And yet, even here, he does not collapse into bitterness or regret. He does something that reveals everything about who he has become. He writes one final letter, not to a crowd, but one person. A young man he raised, taught, trusted. Someone he calls his son. And the tone is different now, more personal, more direct, more urgent. Because he knows time is limited and every word carries weight now. He reminds him of the faith passed down through generations before him, not built overnight, but formed through lives that chose to endure. And then he says something that still speaks directly today. Fan into flame the gift you have been given within you. Do not let it fade. Do not let fear silence what matters. Because fear does not come from strength. It comes from forgetting truth. And that line alone carries more weight than most people realize. Because in moments of pressure, fear feels natural, almost automatic inside. But he reframes it, reminding that fear is not your true identity. Power, love, clarity, those are what you are meant to carry. And that shift changes how you respond when life becomes uncertain suddenly. Because now you are not reacting, you are choosing how to stand. And then he gives one of his strongest final instructions ever written. Preach the truth, consistently, whether people want to hear it or not. When it is welcomed and when it is rejected, stand the same. Because truth does not depend on approval to remain true over time. And that is a principle most people struggle to live out daily, because acceptance often feels safer than standing alone for something real. But he makes it clear, this is not about comfort anymore. It is about finishing what was started, regardless of the outcome. And then comes the moment that defines everything he has lived. He looks back, not with regret, but with calm, steady confidence. I have fought the good fight, he writes without hesitation. I have finished the race, not perfectly, but completely to the end. I have kept the faith through everything that tried to break it. And those words carry weight because of what came before them. Because this is not theory, this is a life that proved it. And maybe this is where the story becomes personal again for you. Because you may not control how your story ends externally, but you do control how you choose to finish internally each day. And that distinction changes everything about how you move forward now. Because finishing is not about perfection, it is about persistence over time. It is about continuing when stopping would feel easier and more comfortable. And then, in one of the most human moments ever recorded, he asks, Bring my cloak, because the cold is real and pressing in. Bring my books, because even now, I still want to grow. And that request reveals something deeply powerful about his mindset. Even at the edge of death, he is still reaching forward, still learning, still thinking, still refusing to shut down completely inside. And that challenges how most people approach their final chapters in life, because many stop growing long before life actually ends completely. But he shows something different, something rare, something worth understanding deeply. That growth does not stop when circumstances become difficult or uncertain. It continues as long as you choose to stay engaged with purpose. And then, quietly, without dramatic announcement, the story comes to close. Not with applause, not with recognition, but with quiet, faithful completion. And tradition tells us how it likely ended shortly after this moment. Execution, swift, final. A life taken but not truly ended. Because what he carried did not stop when his body did. It continued through letters, through people, through ideas that could not die. And that is what makes this ending feel different from everything else. Because it does not feel like defeat, even though it looks like it. It feels like completion, like something finished exactly as it needed. And maybe that is the most important part of the entire story. Not how it looked on the outside, but what it meant underneath everything. Because in the end, the question is not about how you start. It is about whether you stay, endure, and finish what you began. And that question does not belong to him anymore now. It belongs to you and what you choose to do next. Everything you just heard is not history. It is a mirror. Not about a man alone, but about patterns repeating inside every life. Because every letter he wrote was answering a human problem directly. And those problems did not disappear. They simply changed form over time. In Galatia, people believed they had to earn their worth constantly. And today, that same pressure still drives how people see themselves. Work harder, prove more, become enough, and maybe then feel accepted. But the answer remains unchanged. Your value was never meant earned. It was given, before performance ever entered the equation at all. And that truth alone can release pressure most people carry daily. Then, in Thessalonica, fear entered through the reality of death itself, and suddenly everything felt unstable, uncertain, and impossible to understand clearly. Because when loss happens, belief is tested in ways nothing else can. And even today, people still ask those same questions quietly inside. What happens next? What is real? What remains after everything ends? And the answer still holds. What looks like an ending is not final. It is movement, transition, something continuing beyond what you can currently see. And that changes how you carry grief, how you process loss moving forward. Because hope does not erase pain, but it transforms its meaning completely. Then Corinth revealed something else, something even more difficult to face. People do not just break under pressure, they break each other too. Through pride, division, ego, and the need to feel right constantly. And you see it everywhere today, in families, communities, even online spaces, where being correct becomes more important than being connected with others. And the answer remains just as uncomfortable now as it was then. Without love, everything else becomes noise without lasting meaning or value. And that forces a question most people try to avoid answering honestly. Are you building something real, or just defending an image constantly? Then his own life showed something deeper, something harder to accept. That strength is not always found in control, but in breaking open. That weakness is not failure, but often the place growth begins quietly. And that idea challenges everything culture teaches about success and power. Because you are told to hide weakness, not understand what it produces. But his story proves something different, something stronger, something more sustainable. That endurance shapes you more than comfort ever could over time. And then, Romans brings everything into full clarity without avoiding anything difficult. It shows the problem fully without softening it for comfort or approval. But it also shows the solution completely without requiring you to earn it. And that balance is rare because most people only present one side, either all pressure or all comfort, but rarely truth with both combined. And that is why it continues to resonate, because it feels real, because it meets you where you are, not where you pretend to be. And then comes the moment most people fear in their own lives. When everything stops, when movement ends, when progress seems completely gone. And the assumption is always the same, that the story must be over. But his life shows something different, something most people never consider deeply. That purpose does not depend on motion. It depends on direction inside. That even in limitation, something meaningful can continue moving forward quietly. And that changes how you see your own moments of restriction completely. Because now they are not endings, they are different kinds of beginnings. And finally, the last letter reveals something most people avoid thinking about. Not how life starts, but how it ends when everything is stripped away. No image, no success, no audience, just truth remaining underneath everything. And the question becomes simple, but impossible to ignore once asked. Did you stay? Did you endure? Did you finish what you started? Not perfectly, not impressively, but faithfully through everything you faced. And that question is where everything in this story points toward, because it was never meant to stay about Apostle Paul alone. It was meant to move from his life directly into yours now, into your decisions, your pressure, your uncertainty, your personal direction forward. Because you are also writing something, whether you realize it or not. Through your choices, your responses, your willingness to continue when it is hard. And one day, your story will also reach a final moment too. Not announced, not planned perfectly, but real and unavoidable eventually. And what will matter then is not how it looked externally. It will be whether you remained true to what mattered most internally. Whether you kept moving when stopping felt easier and more comfortable daily. Whether you chose purpose over distraction, meaning over temporary relief consistently. Because that is what defines a life. Not moments, but direction over time. And that is what gives everything you do weight and significance eventually. So the real question is not what happened in his life before. The real question is what you will do with yours, starting now. Because you do not need to be perfect to move forward today. You do not need certainty to take the next step in front. You only need the decision to continue, even when it feels unclear. And that decision, repeated daily, becomes something far more powerful eventually. It becomes a life that finishes, not by chance, but by choice. And in a world where everything shifts, breaks, and changes constantly around you, that may be the only thing that truly lasts in the end.